This is Criminal Interrupted. Today, we delve into a case that is a tragedy that caused a decades-long ripple effect. We're talking about the Stayner family. In 1980, the nation watched in awe as Steven Stayner, kidnapped 7 years earlier at the age of 7, returned home as a hero, having just helped another child escape. Steven became a symbol of hope, celebrated in headlines and on television. His story was a painful nightmare with a miracle ending. But the spotlight that illuminated Steven's return cast a deep, terrible shadow over the rest of his family. And in that darkness, a different kind of monster began to form. Nearly 2 decades after Steven's heroic escape, the Stayner family would be dragged back into the national consciousness, but this time as the surname of a brutal, cold-blooded killer. Between February and July of 1999, 4 innocent people, Carole Sund, her daughter Juli, and their friend Silvina Pelosso, and Joie Armstrong, were murdered in or near Yosemite National Park. The killer was Cary Stayner, Steven's older brother. The story of the Stayner family is fundamentally a story of 2 opposing narratives of crime and trauma. To understand the shadow that later fell over the Stayner name, we must first dive into the catastrophic event that defined them: the kidnapping of Stephen Gregory Stayner. Steven Stayner was born April 18, 1965, and was the third of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner in Merced, California. On Monday, December 4, 1972, Steven, then just 7 years old, was walking home from Weaver Elementary School. The distance was short, less than a mile, but that brief journey would stretch into 7 years of horrifying captivity. The truth of Steven Stayner's kidnapping is rooted in a cold, calculated plan executed by 2 men, Kenneth Eugene Parnell and Edward Irvin Murphy. Kenneth Parnell's life before the 1972 kidnapping was marked by instability and a documented history of sexual deviance, facts that were critically overlooked by his employers. In March 1951, Parnell was arrested for raping a young boy and impersonating a police officer. He was sentenced to only 4 years in prison for the crime. Parnell had lured the child by using a deputy sheriff's badge he bought at an Army-Navy surplus store. While imprisoned, he escaped from a state institution in Norwalk, but he was quickly recaptured. In a later 2000 interview about this crime, Parnell offered a chilling rationale, claiming that he molested and kidnapped the boy because his wife was pregnant and he, quote, had to find another outlet. Parnell claimed to have been married 3 times, but only 2 marriages are officially recorded. He married 15-year-old Patsy Jo Dorton in 1949. They had a daughter in 1951 and divorced in 1957. Later that year, he married again and had another daughter. Then he claimed to have married a 3rd and final time in 1968, but no records ever substantiated this claim. More than a decade after the sodomy case, Parnell was convicted of armed robbery in Utah. It was while he was imprisoned for this charge that his second wife filed for divorce. Parnell denied having ever been sexually abused himself. However, a book written about Steven Stayner's ordeal claimed that Parnell was molested at the age of 13 by a boarder in a rooming house his mother owned. By the early 1970s, Parnell was drifting, taking various short-term jobs. His work as a night auditor at the Yosemite Lodge in California in 1972 was simply another transient position. His job provided him with a measure of anonymity and access to people. Honestly, that was a really hard word for me to say. But his background as a convicted sex offender was often not revealed to employers at the time, allowing him to operate freely. Prior to the abduction, Parnell had voiced a desire to acquire a son to fill the void in his life. This was the manipulative pretext he used to draw Edward Irvin Murphy into his criminal plan. Edward Irvin Murphy's background suggests a deeply gullible and simple-minded man who was easily swayed and manipulated by the more dominant Parnell. Murphy worked as a night janitor at the same Yosemite lodge where Parnell was employed. This shared night shift brought the two men into frequent contact. Court records and psychological assessments painted Murphy as a man with low intelligence and childlike naivety. This simplicity made him highly susceptible to Parnell's fabrications. Murphy confessed that Parnell had convinced him that the goal was not criminal or sexual, but humanitarian and pseudo-religious. Parnell, who was adept at assuming different personas, told Murphy he was an aspiring minister who wanted to rescue a boy and raise him in a wholesome religious way. Murphy, believing this story, genuinely thought he was participating in an act of charity, albeit a highly illegal one. Unlike Parnell, Murphy had no known history of predatory crimes, reinforcing the belief that he was an accomplice driven by manipulation rather than a shared predatory urge. On the 4th of December, 1972, Kenneth Parnell and his accomplice, Irvin Murphy, headed from Yosemite into Merced. They parked up near the main road leading out of the town and back toward the national park, the Yosemite Parkway, a route designed for a very quick getaway. The plan hinged on a deceptive religious ruse. Murphy was instructed to hand out religious pamphlets to boys as they walked home from school that afternoon. One of those boys was 7-year-old Steven Stayner. Steven had just left school and was about 4 blocks into his walk home when he was approached by Murphy. Murphy asked the boy if he thought his mother would be willing to make a charitable donation to the church. Steven, a 7-year-old boy taught to trust and respect his elders, readily replied that yes, he definitely thought his mother would be willing to donate. Murphy then offered Steven a lift home so they could chat to his mum about this donation. Steven readily agreed, seeing it as a harmless favour. As he agreed to this, a white Buick van driven by Ken Parnell pulled up next to them. Steven climbed into the cab, and they started to drive. But instead of driving further into Merced toward the Stayner home, they immediately began to drive the opposite direction, toward Yosemite. Parnell and Murphy initially attempted to distract Steven with toys during the drive, which worked for a little while. They eventually pulled up to a payphone. Parnell got out and walked over, pretending to make a call, and when he returned, he delivered the first devastating lie. He told Steven that that was his mother on the phone. And apparently, his mum said that they didn't want him anymore. But it was fine, Parnell claimed, because he was now going to raise Steven as a son, and everything would be all okay. Later, Parnell would intensify the lie, claiming that he had been to court and that Steven's parents had signed over full custody. Steven was, understandably, very confused and terrified by this profound betrayal. Steven was first taken to a cabin in Cathy's Valley, Mariposa County, a location that was, tragically, only several hundred feet from his own maternal grandfather's residence, unbeknownst to the 7-year-old. Parnell then initiated a systematic campaign of brainwashing and emotional abuse aimed at erasing Steven's identity and replacing it with a new, controlled one. Steven was renamed Dennis Gregory Parnell. He was told that he was Parnell's son and was raised as such publicly. During the 7 years that followed, Parnell moved frequently, moving Steven from Mariposa County to various locations, including a period in Mendocino County, California. I'm Australian, so I'm sorry if I'm butchering any of these names. The captivity involved severe abuse and trauma. Steven was repeatedly sexually abused by Parnell. The relationship was volatile and manipulative, with Steven later claiming that Parnell's attitude fluctuated between instances of severe beatings and periods where he would spoil the boy. Despite the captivity and the abuse, Parnell managed to integrate Steven into daily life in a way that fooled neighbours and local school officials. Steven attended school during these years, but the constant threat and psychological control prevented him from ever revealing his true identity or the abuse he was suffering. For Steven, the lines between reality and the false identity created by his capture blurred, a common psychological defense mechanism in long-term hostage situations. As Steven grew older, entering his teenage years and puberty, Parnell's interest in him waned. Parnell decided to seek a new, younger victim to build his family. Steven, now 14 years old, was conscripted by Parnell into aiding in the search for a new boy. Steven later revealed that he intentionally sabotaged these efforts, often making himself seem incompetent at the task until Parnell stopped relying on him. Despite Steven's efforts, in February 1980, Parnell succeeded. He abducted 5-year-old Timothy White from Ukiah, California, with the help of a minor acquaintance of Steven's named Sean Porman. Timothy was brought to the home and presented to Steven as the new younger brother. The sight of Timothy, a child facing the same horrific abuse he had just endured for 7 years, was the catalyst for Steven. He later recounted that he was determined to not let the younger boy suffer the same fate. Steven knew he had to act quickly and decisively. He waited for the opportune moment, which came on the evening of Saturday, March 1st, 1980, when Parnell was away at his night shift job as a clerk at a local motel. With Timothy on his back, Steven took the 5-year-old and began walking. They set off on a harrowing journey, hitchhiking approximately 40 miles toward Ukiah, the city where Timothy lived. Steven's choice of destination was deliberate. He sought out the local police. Unfamiliar with the city and desperate, he knew law enforcement was the best place to find help. Upon arriving at the police station, investigators initially treated Steven as a delinquent. However, the truth soon began to emerge. Steven could not fully articulate the details of his identity, but his clear distress and the story of the younger boy were compelling. A search through missing child posters and interrogation eventually led to a breakthrough. Steven was a missing child. In a powerful moment that captured the years of identity suppression, the 14-year-old said to the police, quote, "I know my first name is Steven." This simple, defiant statement became the headline that gripped the world. By daybreak the following morning, Parnell was arrested. He was later convicted of the kidnappings of both Steven Stayner and Timothy White, and was sentenced to only 7 years, the maximum allowed under California law at the time, of which he only served 5 years of this. It may not shock you to hear that Parnell continued his criminal actions after his release. In January 2003, Parnell was arrested again after trying to coerce his caregiver's sister, Diane Stevens, into buying him a 4-year-old boy for $500. Parnell was, by this time, 71 years old and suffering from diabetes and emphysema, as well as other ailments brought on by an earlier stroke. Good riddance. He required 24-hour nursing care in his cluttered apartment in Berkeley. Diane Stevens was aware of Parnell's past and cooperated with police in setting up a sting operation that would lead to his arrest. According to Stevens' testimony, Parnell requested that the child have a clean rectum, indicating sexual intentions. He paid $100 for a birth certificate and had $400 on his person for the completion of the transaction when he was to receive the child. Parnell was arrested that day, subsequently telling authorities, quote, "I wanted a family." Parnell was convicted on February 9, 2004, on the charges of attempting to purchase a child and attempted child molestation. The prosecution successfully argued that sexual aids and pornography found in the apartment, along with Diane Stevens' own testimony, were enough to prove that Parnell's intentions were criminal in nature. Parnell was sentenced to 25 years to life under California's 3 strikes law. Parnell remained incarcerated until his death at age 76 on January 21, 2008, at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. According to prison officials, Parnell died of natural causes. Returning back to Steven Stayner. Steven's return home after 7 years was a national sensation. The media frenzy was immense, descending upon the Stayners family home in Merced. Steven was hailed as a hero for his courageous escape and his rescue of Timothy White. Yet, the homecoming was not the simple, joyful ending everyone, especially the media, hoped for. Steven returned to his family as a 14-year-old teenager, having been away since he was 7. He had been effectively raised under Parnell's twisted rules, a life that included being allowed to smoke and drink. He faced immense readjustment issues. He had to adapt to a structured family life and the expectations of a boy who had missed 7 years of childhood development. In an interview with Newsweek after his escape, Steven spoke of the challenge. Quote, "I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me the fundamentals all over again, it got better. But why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? Everything has changed. Sometimes I blame myself. I don't know sometimes if I should have come home. Would I have been better off if I didn't?" While his parents were overjoyed, they struggled to connect with the teenager who was physically their son but mentally a stranger. Steven himself noted that his father, Dalbert, often stopped hugging him, a common symptom of a parent struggling to cope with the profound trauma their child has endured. The difficulties were magnified by the relentless media spotlight. Steven's story was a massive sensation, and the press descended on the Stayner family, eager to capture the miracle ending. Steven was forced into the role of a media hero, yet he was still a highly vulnerable victim struggling to cope with PTSD and shame. The fame placed constant pressure on him to be the triumph the public expected, rather than the traumatized boy he actually was. The 1989 miniseries, I Know My First Name is Steven, cemented his celebrity status. While it provided the family with some compensation, it also created a new, distorted reality. His sister later confessed that Steven's own children would sometimes confuse the actor who played their father with their real father, showing how the media narrative had completely overtaken the family's reality. Despite the immense struggle, Steven tried desperately to build a normal life. He married Jodie Edmondson in 1985, and they had 2 children together. He worked various jobs, including as a mechanic, striving for the stability that had been stolen from him. But the trauma never truly left. And on September 16, 1989, Steven Stayner's fight ended tragically when he was killed in a hit-and-run motorcycle accident near Merced, California, at the age of 24. The loss of Steven was the final, devastating blow to a family that had already endured more pain and public scrutiny than anyone should. His death removed the hero of the family, leaving the dark stage wide open for the villain that was already lurking in the shadows. While Steven was the victim of the crime, his older brother, Cary Stayner, became a victim of the subsequent neglect and trauma that enveloped his home. When Steven was abducted in 1972, the lives of Dalbert and Kay Stayner instantly shattered, and for 7 years, every resource, emotional and financial, was poured into finding their son. Then, when Steven miraculously returned as a hero in 1980, the family crisis simply changed form. It did not end. Steven was now a severely traumatized teenager, requiring intense focus to reintegrate into the life he barely remembered, while simultaneously grappling with his new status as a national celebrity. As a result, the needs of the other children, particularly Cary, who was 11 when Steven was taken, were essentially pushed aside. Cary was an adolescent navigating one of the most stressful family environments imaginable. Yet, he had lost his emotional anchor, left feeling profoundly neglected and emotionally abandoned, simply because he wasn't the main tragedy. Cary's internal struggle was compounded by the fact that he was not the normal brother in the house. In his own words, he felt invisible, and when a child feels neglected by their primary caregivers during a critical phase of development, they can develop deep feelings of worthlessness and deep resentment. And I do just want to put this out here right now that this is not an excuse for any of his later behaviour. His existence felt trivial compared to the high-stakes drama surrounding Stephen, and that feeling intensified when Stephen's life became the subject of television movies. This envy twisted his desire for recognition into a desperate, pathological craving. Crucially, however, Cary's story is not a simple case of family trauma creating a killer. The facts show a much darker, pre-existing condition. Cary himself testified that his violent, homicidal fantasies began around the age of 7, 4 years before Stephen's kidnapping. He even claimed to have attempted to act on these impulses and confess to these dark thoughts to his parents. But if these confessions are true, the Stayner parents were unable to follow up with serious psychiatric intervention. The immense financial and emotional strain of the missing Stephen made it impossible to address Cary's urgent needs. The most vulnerable child, the one who was home, was overlooked for the one who was missing. Stephen's nightmare was the catalyst that pushed Cary's already disturbed mind over the edge. Throughout his teen and adult years, Cary developed serious substance abuse issues, including heavy use of drugs and alcohol. He had frequent run-ins with the law, though primarily for minor offences. In discussing Stephen's ordeal, Cary expressed a notable lack of empathy. In one interview, he reportedly stated, quote, "Stephen knew he had the ability to leave, but he didn't. This cold analysis shows a detachment from the victim's perspective and an inability to recognize the psychological captivity Stephen endured." After graduating high school, he worked as a window installer at a glass company, where he developed a fantasy about ramming a truck into the workplace, killing everyone there, and setting the business on fire. In 1991, he tried to kill himself with carbon monoxide. In 1995, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital after claiming to have had a nervous breakdown, and was released after receiving treatment. And by 1999, Stayner was 37 years old, working as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel in El Portal, a perfect place to hide in plain sight, just outside the gateway to Yosemite National Park. The violence that erupted in the winter of 1999 was not impulsive. It was the result of long-simmering, calculated fantasy that had finally found its target. The first 3 victims of Cary Stayner were a mother, her daughter, and their beloved friend. They were not park employees or local residents. They were simply tourists, embarking on a joyful sightseeing trip intended to create lasting memories. The victims were Carole Sund, her daughter Juli, and their friend Silvina Pelosso. Carole Yvonne Sund was 42 years old and known to be an organised, meticulous, and a loving mother and wife. Decades earlier, Carole was a US exchange student in Argentina, where she forged a strong, lifelong friendship with a woman named Carole Pelosso, Silvina's mother. Juliana Sund, also known as Juli, was Carole's 15-year-old daughter, and Silvina Pelosso was only 16 years old. They were typical teenagers, full of life, laughter, and blossoming friendships that mirrored their mothers. Juli and Silvina were inseparable during Silvina's stay in California. Their friendship was a mirror image of their mother's bond, a beautiful connection formed through mutual affection. The trio had spent their last known afternoon hiking in Yosemite. They capped off the day by renting videos from the motel desk, planning a cozy night in, a moment of relaxed vulnerability that Cary Stayner exploited. Juli was a high school student and had just competed in a cheerleading contest before heading to Yosemite for a winter break trip. The three were due to meet Carole's husband, Jolie Sund, at the San Francisco airport the day after they disappeared, but they never showed up. Their failure to arrive signaled immediately to the family that something terrible had happened, as Carole was renowned for her punctuality and organization. On February 15th, Stayner executed his plan with cold precision. He used his knowledge of the motel's operations to gain access to the women's room, later confessing that he fabricated a reason, like a faulty water leak, to get the door open. Once inside, he produced a semi-automatic handgun, immediately seizing control of the room and the lives of all three. The attack was swift and brutal. Cary bound the three victims, Carole, Juli, and Silvina, effectively eliminating their ability to resist or escape. The escalation of violence was rapid. Stayner first strangled Carole, quickly disposing of her body to ensure he had full control over the two young girls. In the hours that followed, the unimaginable happened. Stayner sexually assaulted both Juli and Silvina before he completed his horrific act by strangling Silvina. This was the culmination of his fantasies, a methodical and calculated taking of life, fueled by the desire for control and the deep-seated need to finally make himself the focus of a national tragedy. Carole, Juli, and Silvina's disappearance immediately launched one of the most intense missing persons investigations in California history. The fact that an entire family, simply enjoying a national park vacation, could vanish without a trace transfixed the country. The media coverage was immediate and massive, the very spotlight that Cary Stayner had been seeking for years. The massive search effort involved the FBI, the National Park Service, and hundreds of local law enforcement officers. Stayner himself calmly went back to work, watching the chaos he had created, likely enjoying the attention that was now focused on his workplace and his every movement, though he remained overlooked as a suspect. The case remained a baffling mystery for weeks, until March 18th. In a remote area known as Long Barn, over 50 miles away from the motel, the charred remains of Carole's rental car was discovered. The vehicle had been set on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. Inside the trunk, investigators made the horrifying discovery of the badly burned bodies of Carole Sund and Silvina Pelosso. This development turned the missing persons case into a sensational murder investigation, confirming the public's worst fears. However, the body of Juli Sund was still missing. Her disappearance, coupled with the brutal discovery of her mother and friend, fueled the intense media scrutiny and the terror of a killer on the loose. Cary Stayner was watching this all unfold from his post at the Cedar Lodge. The search for Juli and the killer would continue until the next shocking development, which was the horrifying taunt from the killer himself. In a chilling move designed purely to maximize his notoriety and inject himself into the investigation, Cary Stayner sent an anonymous, handwritten letter to the FBI. This letter included a hand-drawn map directing law enforcement to the location of Juli's body. The note reportedly contained a deeply disturbing, psychopathic tone that revealed the killer's detachment and desire for recognition. The map also stated, quote, "We had fun with this one." Following the map, investigators found Juli's body at a remote reservoir overlook in Tullamoon County. She had been sexually assaulted and tragically killed. Her throat was slit. A brutal finality to the family's ordeal. The discovery confirmed that a cold, calculating killer was not only operating in the area, but was actively engaging with the investigation. After the horrific murders of Carole, Juli, and Silvina, the man they knew as the unassuming motel handyman stayed quiet for several months, seemingly relishing in the chaos and fear he had unleashed. He had tasted the notoriety he craved, and the silence could only last so long. The urge to control, to command national attention, was too strong to ignore. On July 21st, 1999, Stayner targeted his final confirmed victim, 26-year-old Yosemite naturalist Joie Armstrong. Friends and family universally described Joie as a driven and vibrant young woman. She was full of laughter, creativity, and a tremendous enthusiasm for life, using her infectious smile and warm heart to connect with everyone she met. Joie was a naturalist and educator for what was then known as the Yosemite Institute, now known as Nature Bridge. Her mission was to connect children to their environment, and she was fiercely dedicated to it. Joie was planning to visit friends in Sausalito and had her truck packed for the trip when Cary Stayner spotted her near her remote cabin in the Forester area. He abducted her at gunpoint, forcing her into his vehicle. As he drove, Joie Armstrong displayed a moment of desperate, incredible courage. Knowing her life was in imminent danger, she fought back and threw herself out of the moving car in a desperate bid to escape. Stayner was not deterred. He pursued her into the surrounding woods, catching her and dragging her deeper into the undergrowth as she struggled for her life. The attack that followed was characterized by an extreme, personal violence that marked an escalation from his previous crimes. Stayner killed her during the struggle and then committed the final savage act. He decapitated Joie Armstrong. The sheer brutality and brazenness of this attack, committed inside the national park boundaries, shattered the remaining sense of safety in the region. The murder sent a shockwave of terror through the tight-knit community of park employees and solidified the horrifying truth. A serial killer was operating with impunity in one of America's most treasured natural landscapes, and he was becoming more savage with every victim. The tragedy of Joie Armstrong, like Carole, Juli, and Silvina, stands as a stark reminder of the innocent lives violently stolen by a man obsessed with seizing the national spotlight from his own dead brother. For months, Cary Stayner had been a ghost, a maintenance man at the motel where the three women had been murdered, helping the FBI collect evidence samples and remaining so calm under initial questioning he was completely off their radar. He had virtually no criminal record, aside from minor drug offences, and investigators simply didn't see him as a suspect in the horrific Sund Pelosso murders. It was the murder of Joie Armstrong in July 1999 that finally exposed the killer. Following the discovery of a decapitated body, investigators began to canvass the remote Forester area. They quickly received a crucial tip. An eyewitness reported seeing a pale blue 1972 International Scout, a very distinct older vehicle, parked near Joie Armstrong's cabin the day before her killing. Detectives traced the vehicle's registration directly to Cary Stayner, the handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel. The sheer coincidence, a motel employee linked to the first crime scene and now directly linked to the final crime scene, forced the FBI to pivot their investigation and place Stayner at the very top of their list. Stayner was quickly located far from Yosemite. On July 24, 1999, FBI agents, including Special Agent Jeff Rennick, tracked Stayner to a remote location, the Laguna del Sol nudist resort outside Sacramento. Stayner was detained and brought in for questioning at the FBI offices in Sacramento. This was not a formal arrest yet, but a critical interrogation. The agents used the long drive from the nudist resort to the office to their advantage, engaged Stayner in what Rennick later described as a simple human conversation. Stayner opened up, even discussing his complex feelings about his brother Steven's fame and his captor's light sentence. Rennick, a seasoned investigator, was building a rapport, and Stayner, a man desperately craving an audience, was finally finding someone who would listen to his story. The relationship Rennick established paid off immediately. Once inside the interview room, Stayner stunned the agents by volunteering to confess. But true to his dramatic and controlling nature, he initially tried to negotiate a deal for his cooperation, asking for a sizable reward for his family, a transfer to a prison near his home, and most disturbingly, child pornography. Agent Rinnick and his colleagues refused the illegal requests, but continued to appeal to the part of Stayner that craved finality and relief. The appeal worked. Stayner began his formal confession, starting with the murder of Joie Armstrong. Over the next 6 hours, he calmly and chillingly recounted every horrific detail of the abduction, assault, and murder of Carole Sund, Juli Sund, and Silvina Pelosso. He explained his calculated planning and, crucially, revealed his primary motive: attention. Stayner told the agents that he wanted the world to know that while Steven was the family's hero, he was the real villain. Cary was then arrested and charged. Following his startling and complete confession, Cary Stayner faced justice in 2 separate court systems, reflecting the complexity of his crimes committed both on federal parkland and state territory. Because the murder of Joie Armstrong occurred inside the boundaries of Yosemite National Park, it was prosecuted as a federal capital case. Facing the possibility of a federal death sentence, Cary Stayner ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted sexual abuse resulting in death in November 2000. In exchange for his plea, federal prosecutors spared his life. Stayner was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of Joie Armstrong. During the sentencing hearing for the case, Stayner, in a rare display of public emotion, broke down and offered an apology. He told the courtroom, quote, "I wish I could take it back, but I can't. I wish I could tell you why I did such a thing, but I don't even know myself. I'm so sorry." Next, Stayner was tried in state court for the murders of Carole Sund, Juli Sund, and Silvina Pelosso. This was the pivotal trial that determined his final fate. Stayner's defense team conceded he was the murderer, but mounted a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. They argued that Stayner suffered from profound mental illness, including obsessive-compulsive disorder and paraphilia, exacerbated by the childhood trauma of Steven's kidnapping and the resulting family chaos. They sought to prove he lacked the required mental capacity to form the specific intent necessary for first-degree murder. The jury was not convinced, though. After reviewing the evidence, including Stayner's own meticulous planning and chilling confessions, the jury found him sane and guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances: multiple murder, murder during the commission of a felony, and kidnapping. The prosecution successfully argued that his methodical planning demonstrated clear intent. In the final penalty phase, the jury recommended death. On December 12, 2002, Cary Stayner was formally sentenced to death. The story of Steven and Cary Stayner is more than a true crime narrative. It is a relentless, cascading tragedy that shattered not just one family, but 5. We must remember the women whose lives were brutally and senselessly extinguished by a man obsessed with fame. We remember the bright, loving spirit of Joie Armstrong, a naturalist whose greatest joy was connecting people to the wild beauty of Yosemite. We remember Carole Sund, a dedicated mother and friend, and the 2 teenagers, her daughter Juli Sund, and her friend Silvina Pelosso, whose young lives were cut short while on a trip designed for friendship and adventure. For the Armstrong, Sund, and Pelosso families, there is no healing. There is only a lifelong burden of grief caused by a killer's selfish need for spotlight. But there is also the tragic story of Delbert and Kay Stayner. Kay Stayner had her son stolen for 7 years, only to watch him struggle with trauma and ultimately die young in an accident. Then, a decade later, she learned that her eldest son, Cary, was a cold-blooded serial killer. Their lives became a permanent, agonizing media spectacle defined by their 2 sons. The spotlight that once celebrated Stephen's survival ultimately consumed the entire family in darkness. Cary Stayner achieved the notoriety he craved, but he did so by trading his brother's title of hero for his own self-proclaimed title of villain. He now sits on death row, his legacy sealed not by his early life trauma, but by the conscious, wicked choices he's made. Thank you for listening.